In the Antarctic summer of 1908-1909, Sir Ernest Shackleton and 3 companions attempted to travel to the South Pole from their winter quarters. They set off with 4 ponies to help carry the load. Weeks later, their ponies dead, rations all but exhausted, they turned back toward their base, their goal not accomplished. Altogether, they trekked 127 days. On the return journey, as Shackleton records, in the heart of the Atlantic, the time was spent talking about food, elaborate feasts, gourmet delights, sumptuous menus. As they staggered along, suffering from dysentery, not knowing whether they would survive, every waking hour was occupied with thoughts of eating. We can understand Shackleton's obsession with food, which offers a glimpse of the passion Jesus was talking about when he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." The entire Beatitude says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." As we look at this Beatitude, we notice first the requirement. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. There's an old French proverb that says, "A good meal ought to begin with hunger." Have you ever got to time for lunch or time for supper or dinner, if you want to call it that, and you weren't hungry? Maybe because you'd eaten too much at a previous meal. It's not very satisfying to think about eating if you're not hungry. Sometimes we say, "I'm starving," or "I'm dying of thirst." Have we ever truly been that hungry or thirsty? Maybe at some point in your life you were. But most of us, I think, just from what I know about us, are never really starving to death these days. I'm certainly not going to make that claim. Sometimes our spiritual hunger and thirst is also misdirected. A man named Bob became envious of his friends because they had larger and more luxurious homes than he did. So he listed his house with a real estate firm, planning to sell it and to purchase a more impressive home. Shortly afterward, as he was reading the classified section of the newspaper, he saw an ad for a house that seemed just right. He immediately called the realtor and said, "A house described in today's paper is exactly what I'm looking for. I would like to go through it as soon as possible." The agent asked him several questions about it and then replied, "But Bob, that's your house." He didn't realize that he already had what he really wanted. Once a young man kneeled before a beautiful young woman beside a placid lake. "Darling," he said, "I want you to know that I love you more than life. I want you to marry me. I'm not a wealthy man. I don't have a yacht, a Rolls Royce, or lots of money like Johnny Green. But I do love you with all my heart." The young woman paused for a moment and said, "Darling, I love you with all my heart too. But before I say yes, tell me a little more about Johnny Green." Sometimes we have this hunger and thirst, and it gets a bit misdirected. You know, we say we love God, but we become easily distracted by other interests. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones wrote, "If every man and woman in the world knew what it was to hunger and thirst after righteousness, there would be no danger of war." Now let's think about that. Let's think about how wars start. It usually starts because there's somebody who has a great desire, not for righteousness, but for something of unrighteousness. They want something that doesn't belong to them. Someone said people wrap themselves up in the flimsy garments of their own righteousness and then complain of the cold. What is righteousness? has some different meanings. It is a right standing with God, and we receive that through God's grace, through the blood of Jesus. It is a right way of living. This is what we aim to do when we are saved by God's grace. There is a righteousness in dealing with each other, a social righteousness. But sometimes we have our own concept of righteousness. We trust in our own actions, thinking that this is enough to satisfy God. That will not work. There was a man who made a documentary in which he ate at a fast food restaurant 3 times a day for 30 days. In his film called Super Size Me, Morgan Spurlock, a formerly fit filmmaker, packed on 25 pounds. When asked what happened to his body over the course of the 30 days, Spurlock responds, "My body just basically falls apart. I start to get tired, I start to get headaches, my blood sugar skyrockets, my cholesterol goes up off the charts. The doctors were like, 'You have to stop.' When he was asked how he felt at the end of the month, he shouts out, 'I felt terrible. I would eat and I would feel so good because I would get all that sugar and caffeine and fat, and an hour later, I would just crash. I would hit the wall and be angry and depressed and upset. I was a disaster to live with.'" Well, what he discovered in physical eating, what maybe you really want at the moment, may not be what is best for you. One preacher talked about, we noticed that almost all children like McDonald's Chicken McNuggets. They would choose that over something far better. And sometimes we don't outgrow our desire for foods full of fat, full of sugar, that aren't the best for us. Well, spiritually, sometimes we want to partake of what is just good at the moment, what seems to satisfy, but really, we are not hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Our desires for something inadequate. John Stott said, "The hungry and thirsty whom God satisfies are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." Such spiritual hunger is a characteristic of all God's people, whose supreme ambition is not material but spiritual. Christians are not like pagans, engrossed in the pursuit of possessions. What they have set themselves to seek first is God's kingdom and righteousness. We are to seek first, or we are to hunger for righteousness. Hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's the reason. Righteousness must be the object of intense desire, earnest yearning, and relentless pursuit. We must really want righteousness. Ray Pritchard points out that there are 4 other uses of this word, righteousness, in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, verse 10. "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness." This is the 8th beatitude. And taken together with the 4th, we get something like this. Righteousness is a lifestyle that distinguishes us as true Christians and invites opposition from the world. Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." The religious teachers of the day concocted a religious system built on intricate rules and regulations. True righteousness starts in the heart and changes a person from the inside out. Matthew chapter 6, verse 1. "Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." The Pharisees in Jesus' day loved to be noticed by others, either by praying out loud or rattling their coins in the offering plate. True disciples seek a righteousness that doesn't need to be seen by others, but only by God. And then, as we near the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:33, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Seeking God's righteousness should come before anything else. Now let's put these four passages together. We are to hunger and thirst after a truly Christian lifestyle that changes us from the inside out, so that we no longer seek the praise of others, but seek God's approval above everything else. More specifically, to hunger and thirst after righteousness is to do whatever it takes to be in a right relationship with Jesus. An old Scottish prayer said, "O God, make me just as holy as a pardoned sinner can be." We should live in such a way that we are holy. Well, with every one of the Beatitudes, there's not only the requirement, but there is the reward. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled. They will be filled. Now, when we are hungry before we sit down to the table, and when we eat a good, delicious meal, we can say, when we get through, I'm full. I'm satisfied. That's a good feeling. We talk about comfort food even. Some things, that was so good. If we have a hunger and a thirst for righteousness, when we make that our goal, to be righteous before God, we have satisfaction. We are in a right relationship with God. I guess another way of thinking about this hungering and thirsting would be to think about not being able to get your breath. Have you ever experienced that? I occasionally, fortunately very occasionally, have this dream where I can't get my breath. It sure is good to wake up from that dream and realize I was just dreaming. Perhaps you've had the experience where you just couldn't catch your breath. Maybe you choked on something. Maybe you had one of those coughing fits from allergies. It's so good when you can finally get that air back in. We must have the hunger, the thirst for righteousness. The reward will come. Jack Lewis wrote, "The carnal man has no taste for things spiritual. A longing for righteousness will bring its possessor to righteousness. Those who do hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled with what they have an appetite for." What are we hungry for? John Piper writes, "The hunger and thirst of your life that cannot be satisfied by anything in this world is the constant beckoning of God to remember that we were made for another world. We were made for God." We must hunger and thirst for the right thing, for righteousness. And then we